All right, evening everybody. I'm Mike, I'm with Occupy London, and today we've got David McNally speaking. It's a great honor having him down from Toronto. David is, one sec here, there we go, author of several books, including Global Slump, and David teaches political science at York University and actively supports numerous social justice movements in that city. And his research includes the theory of and practice of democracy, Marxism and anti-racism. And I won't read too much more of the bio, but everybody put their hands together for David.
Thanks very much, Mike. And let me start by saying that when I was asked if I could come and make this meeting, I told the Occupy London organizers that I would do everything that I could for reasons that I'll explain. I think the Occupy movement represents one of the most significant social political developments in a very long time, and Occupy London is, I believe, doing really important creative, energetic work in sorting through what the Occupy movement ought to be doing in the aftermath of the encampments, the tenting, and so on. I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about some of that more in the discussion period. What I really wanted to do tonight was to start with the obvious moment that's bringing us together, the thing which is bringing me back to your city tomorrow, the rally called by the Ontario Federation of Labour in support of the locked-out electromotive workers, and talk about how that event relates to the larger social, economic, and political moment that we find ourselves in. And to really do justice to that, I want to start with the financial crisis that broke out in early 2008. Because in my view, the economic financial crisis of 2008 and 9 represented a transformative moment. It represented the end of one period that lasted a quarter century or so, and the beginning of a new period. A period that's going to be very, very different economically. It's going to be much more turbulent, much more difficult for ordinary working people. And politically, I believe it's going to be much more volatile. There are going to be a lot of attacks coming from those in power, and there's going to be, as we've already seen, a lot of resistance from those of us outside of power who nevertheless have our own kinds of power to exercise, as our resistance movements have shown. So let me start my remarks with what happened in 2008-9 and how we're living with the fallout from that. Because I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the financial meltdown and the economic crash of 2008-9 was the most significant economic crisis for Western capitalism since the 1930s. I mean, in my teaching in political economy, for years and years, I would tell students there are 5 investment banks on Wall Street, 5 big investment banks. Well, in the course of about 6 months, every one of them collapsed. Some of them were gone permanently. Others were restructured by government and turned into different kinds of entities, but all 5 investment banks on Wall Street collapsed in the course of that crisis. Banks collapsed in Iceland, Ireland, Scotland, England, Germany, Britain, Italy, Spain, and so on, as well as the US. There was a panic in ruling circles, really the like of which we haven't seen since the great stock market crash in the fall of 1929. And the difference this time was that central banks, the government-run banks that backstop the whole of our financial system, did what they didn't do in the 1930s. They intervened massively. They organized the largest coordinated rescue of banks that we've ever seen. They threw their first hundreds of billions of dollars to solve the crisis. That wasn't enough. They threw hundreds of billions more. That wasn't enough. They threw some trillions on top of that. And if we start to factor in the latest round of bailouts that have been happening in Europe, we are probably now in the 27 or 28 trillion dollar range for the scale of the global bailout of the banks and the economic stimulus programs that governments introduced at that point. Now, 27, 28 trillion dollars is a lot of bread. I can't wrap my mind around it really, but so I find that one statistic is a very useful way of trying to make some sense of it. 27 or 8 trillion is the equivalent of the value of all the goods and services that the US economy produces in the course of 2 years. So imagine taking all the wealth produced by the world's largest economy for 2 years and basically giving it to the banks. And that's what they've done. And as I'll say a little bit in a moment, they're not finished yet. There's more European bailouts coming. They haven't exhausted this by any means. And I'll also say quickly in passing, but I'm really happy to come back and talk about this later if you'd like to do this in the discussion period. It is complete falsehood when our federal finance minister, Flaherty, says over and over again, we didn't bail out the banks in Canada. That is a complete lie. The banks were bailed out here as well. It's true that none collapsed. That's true. But it is not true that there was no bailout. And then we have to remind ourselves that in addition to the banking bailout, which I can give you lots of figures on later if you want, we also had a made in Canada bailout of General Motors and Chrysler also. So hundreds of billions were also spent in Canada to bail out ailing corporations. Now, they didn't care what it cost when they did it. I think many of you will remember all of the claims at different stages in different debates during Canadian elections and so on. Oh, we can't afford a national child care program. Oh, we couldn't possibly expand Medicare to include pharmacare. The cupboard is empty. Well, when the banks were collapsing, the cupboard sure as hell wasn't empty. They found as much as they needed, and as I said, they just kept pumping it in and pumping it in until they stopped the banking collapse. So as a result, they did eventually, with that scale of government spending, they did stop the process of the financial meltdown, the bank collapses. But that simply meant that the crisis that we entered in 2008 was going to morph into a different form of crisis. It's not that the crisis itself disappeared, they simply shifted it. And put really simply, they shifted it from the private sector to the public sector. Because once they ran up those bills, then they had to pay them. Because fundamentally when governments do bailouts, they borrow the money for it. They go to world financiers, they sell them government bonds, they take the money, and eventually they have to pay that money back to the hedge funds, banks, and so on, who buy their bonds. So they ran up big debts to do this bailout. Now, there were many possible ways in which these debts could be dealt with, including, by the way, just repudiating them, which is what Greece should do, for instance. There's lots of possible ways. You could, for instance, increase taxes on wealth to pay them off if you didn't want to go the road of repudiating them. But one after another, governments in our neoliberal age have had one simple response to paying back the bills for the bailout, and that is austerity, as they call it. Cut government spending. It is the people who rely upon government social services and the workers who deliver those services who are now in the front lines of paying for that crisis. And they are very clear in ruling class circles that this is a very long-term proposition. I remember when they first started talking about austerity, the International Monetary Fund referred to a decade of austerity. And then around the time of the G20 meetings in Toronto a year and a half ago, they switched it to age. Decade wasn't long enough. We're now talking about an age of austerity. And in their own documents, they often talk about a generation, roughly 20 years or so, that they imagine they are going to continue to carve back, to cut into government spending in order to offset the costs of the bank bailouts. And so that's what we're dealing with. And I want to say a little bit about some of the sort of tangible human dimensions of it before drawing out some of the other implications of this age of austerity. But let me just give you a few highlights as to what it looks like. Latvia last year fired 1/3 of all teachers in the country. Greece has cut pensions about 50%. Just means that millions of people who thought they would be able to retire, not high on the hog, but with a pension that would at least allow them to live with some basic dignity above the poverty line, have now been plunged below the poverty line. The city of Detroit was told by the state of Michigan in the summer that it was going to have to close half its schools. And the projections are that class sizes will rise to 60 in one of the most economically depressed cities in the United States. We have today something very, very close now to 50 million people in the United States who are living on the most minimal form of social welfare, food stamps. Now, food stamps aren't necessarily always stamps anymore, like they used to be. Sometimes they're debit cards that you can use at certain grocery stores and so on. But what's quite interesting about this is that the majority of people receiving food stamps today, the majority of adults receiving food stamps, are working. They're not fully unemployed. They simply cannot survive on the wages that they're drawing. And so that, as I say, is just an attempt to give you some highlights that illustrate what the age of austerity means, and then we have to think about the implications of this going on year after year after year. I mean, here in Ontario, we're going to see both a provincial austerity budget and a federal austerity budget coming down in the next number of months, where what we're facing at the moment in Toronto, tens of millions of dollars in cuts to social programs, will then also be duplicated at other levels of government spending. And so that's the context for it. And what's interesting is that occasionally, even voices in the mainstream are remarkably forthright about this. Those of you who have heard me speak before and so on will know that I don't very often favorably quote central bankers. It's sort of almost a religious conviction that central bankers are, I never just say anything polite about them. But there was a remarkable speech last year by Mervyn King, Governor of the Bank of England, the British Central Bank. And I just have to share this one with you, and I'm going to come back to two parts of it in the rest of my remarks. Mervyn King told a parliamentary committee, a Treasury committee, in this speech in March of last year, "The price of this financial crisis is being borne by people who absolutely did not cause it. Now is the period when the cost is being paid. I'm surprised that the degree of public anger has not been greater than it has." I'm going to come back and talk about that second part in a few minutes as well. But note first the admission that the people who were paying for the crisis are by no means the people who caused it. Remarkably candid. And then, of course, one of the other realities about the degree of public anger is that the mainstream media have bought into an elite discourse, an elite story that's being told over and over and over again, completely trying to wipe out any memory of the financial crisis and to tell us that the problem is that we live beyond our means for too long. That's the problem. The Greek people expected too much, and sooner or later that caught up with them. It is a complete falsehood, and it's based on simply telling the same story over and over and over again, in the hopes that it acquires such a kind of common sense resonance that we lose sight of what Mervyn King acknowledged here. The source of the problem was a bank collapse and a set of bank meltdowns, and now they're making the public pay. One of the inevitable results of this age of austerity, of course, is that it tends to tip economies back into collapse. And that's what we're seeing across Europe right now, where the austerity is the most intense, as they try to continue to bail out the banks. Some of you will have seen that this week the International Monetary Fund asked for another $500 billion for its rescue fund for European banks. They were already putting together $500 billion. They said, no, 500 million is not going to do it. We're going to need a full $1 trillion to carry out the next stage of our bank rescues in Europe. But what it does, austerity, in addition to destroying social services and imposing the human hardship that comes with that, is that in driving hundreds of thousands of public sector workers out of work, it drives the economy back into slump. After all, you can't take the level of spending that hundreds of thousands of people did out of the economy, as they either lose their jobs or go to reduced hours, go to reduced wages, and so on. Their spending decreases. Britain plans to get rid of 400,000 public employees. That's like written into their austerity documents. And as a result, the Greek economy contracted by more than 6% last year. Italy, Spain, Portugal, all contracting. France is now contracting. Britain is now contracting. Even Germany shrank in the last quarter of last year, we've just discovered. And as that happens, unemployment is soaring. And not surprisingly, those who are paying the greatest price for the soaring unemployment are youth. I mean, it's extraordinary to think, when we take the case of Spain, that the official government figure for unemployment is now rocketing towards 25%. Just last month it went over 24%. The official government figure for youth unemployment has now hit almost exactly 50%. Half of all young people in the labor market unable to find work. Greece is catching up. Ireland has gone from an unemployment rate well below 7% to one approaching 15%. What's happening in country after country after country, and yet they're not declaring unemployment a crisis that needs trillion-dollar bailout funds. No, it's the banks. And so we're seeing a consistent pattern here, and we need to be clear that even though the austerity agenda slows down the economy and maybe even tips it back towards crisis, they will persist with it. I'm convinced that they will persist with it. And notwithstanding the anger that you get from a handful of mainstream economists who see at one level, the economic insanity of it, they're going to persist because ultimately, when everything is said and done, a capitalist economy does not revolve around maximizing the output of goods and services or maximizing job creation. It revolves around one central imperative: to maximize profits. And if laying people off and destroying jobs produces higher profits, if cutting workers' wages 50% produces higher profits, it may not have good implications for the economy as a whole, but capitalism was never about the economy as a whole. Capitalism was basically, as Occupy has taught us, about the 1%. And right now, and this is one of the enormous learning, teaching points for us all in this, right now the 1% are doing very, very well. Since about the middle of 2009, profits have started to go back up after the first 8 to 12 months of the crisis. Incomes were soaring again, bankers' bonuses are rising, and sure tell giveaway for all of it, luxury good consumption is just taking off. Everywhere, luxury good sales are soaring. And so, really, we are confronted then with that fundamental characteristic of capitalism, that so long as profit maximization is operating, so long as that is being protected and preserved, doesn't really matter what happens to the economy as a whole. I'm not saying they would prefer growing profits and a more vigorous economy. Of course they would. But if it's a trade-off between rising profits and a vigorous economy, profits will come first, time and time again. Next point I'll make before shifting gears and talking about the second part of the Mervyn King quote is we need to remind ourselves also over and over again when they talk about the deficit, that deficits are not simply about the spending side of the equation. In any basic economic balance sheet, there are two elements. There's income, or revenue, and there's expenditure. Government keeps saying to us, because these are out of balance, it's spending that must be cut. But of course, the other option is to bring revenue up. Right? Impose a Tobin tax on financial transactions. If you simply restored taxes on the wealthy and on corporations in Canada to where they were in 1980, there would be no deficit. Just move taxes back to where they were in 1980 levels. Now, I tend to favor more radical change than that, but just do that, and you wipe out the deficit, okay? So we need to be clear. You can adjust it very, very easily without ever touching spending. You can get rid of the deficit if that's what you're obsessed with, okay? It's not my obsession, but if that was what you were focused on. Okay, now, Mervyn King also says to us here, I'm surprised that the degree of public anger has not been greater than it has. And I think there's something to that sentiment, but I also want to take a couple of minutes to remind all of us that it is not true that working class and poor people around the world just have laid down as the austerity agenda has been imposed. It's true, by and large, we have not resisted and mobilized to the degree necessary to overturn that austerity agenda. But consider, the financial crisis hits in 2008, and before the year is out, we see the first significant factory occupation in the United States since the 1930s that were public windows indoors in Chicago. Okay. Factory occupation, right off the bat, in the city that gave birth to May Day, whose worker struggles, going back over 100 years, have that kind of historic global significance. And interestingly, many of the workers who occupied that plant were veterans of the immigrant workers upheaval just a few years earlier, when millions of workers, immigrant workers in the United States, refused to work on May Day as a protest over their conditions of life. That factory occupation
in Chicago was followed by scores and scores of factory occupations, not only across much of Europe, but also the 5 auto parts plants in southern Ontario that were occupied at different times in 2009. The problem was that in this context, the employing class was so prepared to play hardball that a factory occupation in itself wasn't going to save jobs. It tended sometimes to produce better severance pay, but that was it. You got a better deal losing your job. The only cases that I'm aware of that factory occupations actually saved jobs came in France. And some of you will remember that there was a unique wrinkle to many of the factory occupations of 2009 in France. They were called boss nappings. You didn't just occupy the factory, you also took the boss and held him. But no physical harm came to these bosses who were just saying, you're part of the occupation now. But the point is, it upped the level of so much that in some cases, contracts were signed that guaranteed jobs till 2014 and 2015 and so on. But that was, I think, already an indicator that the employing class was so committed to their agenda that unless our side was going to really also bring its A game, so to speak, really raise the level of militancy and resistance, we weren't going to have a chance. And what I find particularly interesting is that we've also seen a wave of general strikes across Europe. Greece has had about a dozen in the last 2 years. But France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland have also all seen general strikes. But again, the dominant class has more or less decided that they don't like one-day general strikes, but they'll ride them out. And once more, we have one case of successful general strikes during the age of austerity. And interestingly, they come in the French semi-colonies of Guadeloupe and Martinique. General strikes in early 2009, which had a number of characteristics distinctive from the general strikes that we've seen in Europe. First, the unions participated in the creation of genuinely broad-based, democratic, grassroots coalitions. So in Guadeloupe, there was a coalition of 50 organizations, students groups, women's organizations, anti-poverty groups, and so on, as in a coalition with the main unions. One of my favorite names of all time for the coalition in Guadeloupe, Stand Up Against Exploitation. They call it the coalition. And furthermore, when France sent in military police after a couple of weeks of general strike, and note that, I'll come back to that point in a moment, then once again, the grassroots rose up, street fighting ensued, they pushed the military police back into their quarters where they just weren't coming out anymore, and the general strike persisted for a full month, a full 30 days. Final thing I want to emphasize about it is the nature of the key demand. In Guadeloupe, and then subsequently some weeks later in Martinique, they said, we've got a whole range of demands, but there is one absolutely non-negotiable demand. It is a €200 a month wage increase for the lowest paid. And they said, those of us who are better paid, that's fine, we won't get as much. But the lowest paid, €200 a month, and that's non-negotiable. It's equivalent, by the way, to about $250 a month increase. Very, very significant. And so they made the interests of the lowest paid workers the uncompromised and uncompromising demand of their struggle. So the building of a real grassroots coalition structure, the preparedness not just to engage in a one-day general strike, but an unlimited general strike until it's settled, and a refusal to compromise on the interest of the lowest paid. gave that strike a dynamism and an energy and a forcefulness. It kept the whole society mobilized. And not surprisingly, after 30 days, France did cave in. That demand was conceded, as was a whole series of others around electricity prices, gas prices, and so on. So I highlight that case because until the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt last year, we had seen nothing like it since the onset of this crisis. I won't spend a lot of time on the so-called Arab Spring, except to make a few quick points about it. First, there is no question that if you wanted to say what demographic group drove those struggles forward at their inception, it was the same social layer that drove the Occupy movement forward. It was young people, precarious workers, students, and so on, who took to the streets, seized Tahrir Square in Cairo, the equivalent spaces in Alexandria, Suez, and other cities, and so on. But it was also the case that turning points came in both Tunisia and Egypt when the courage and the militancy and the creativity of the youth activists pushed very, very significant sections of the working class movement into action. In Tunisia, it happened through the old structures of the existing labor movement. In Egypt, it happened through the creation of new independent unions. But when Mubarak left in early February of last year, it was about 4 or 5 days into a rising wave of strikes, which really marked the point at which the rest of the generals and the Egyptian ruling class said, this is now getting out of control. This is now taking on a character that is so worrying, we'll sacrifice Mubarak. They never, by the way, like to sacrifice their heads of state, even if they hate them, because the idea that the population can learn that a head of state can be overthrown is very, very dangerous. And so when they agreed to let them go, they really had to have been pushed. Even if they hate the bastard, it doesn't matter. They don't want the population to win victory. And that, of course, is the scenario that we saw in both Tunisia and Egypt. Many of you, of course, know that by last summer, the struggle that had been taking the form of general strikes across much of Europe then produced the youth uprisings often known as the upsurge of the Indignants, where particularly in Spain, but also in Greece and Italy, tens of thousands of young people were occupying city squares, throwing up tents, always referring back to Tahrir Square and the inspiration of the Egyptian Revolution, and of course, the wonderful moment that we then saw later in the year where Occupy Wall Street opened up this new moment for us, particularly those of us who were politically active in North America, really kind of generalized the cycle of revolt and brought it right back to Wall Street where the crisis had begun. I mean, very, very significant that comes full circle. Wall Street starts the crisis, and then the resistance moves back to the very epicenter. And of course, is both learning from, borrowing from, and innovating upon the Occupy tactics that we had seen across Tunisia, Egypt, Spain, and so on. I think now what's clear is that Occupy found a way of speaking a language of grassroots resistance and economic justice that resonated throughout North American society in a way in which we have not seen such a radical discourse really resonate since at least the heydays of the social movements of the 1960s and early 1970s. We were talking really about a period of something close to 40 years since the message of a youth-based radical social movement struck such a deep chord within large sections of the working class. And that, of course, is something to be immensely hopeful about. It tells us that both innovative forms of organizing and creative ways of messaging, because what's one of the things we have to really honor Occupy for. They didn't stand up there and go, the bourgeoisie exploits the proletariat and that's why we need to rise up. They found a much more accessible language of social and economic justice and of democracy in action. And in a certain sense, I would argue, it represents something like the kind of period when I, as a teenager, first joined the movement against the Vietnam War, which is to say, a period in which a new left is emerging. And I don't mean to suggest that a new left never owes anything to its predecessors, but new lefts have to be able to reinvent. They have to be able to find new methods of struggle, new forms of organizing, new languages of criticism and resistance, and not to be bound by the older forms. To be sure, as I say, I don't want to at all do a disservice to the earlier generations who struggled and fought, but every real left that is connecting with growing layers of people within society has to also create its new forms. And I believe that that's what we've been seeing with Occupy, is a capacity to do that and to articulate a language of struggle and resistance, which, you know, I think many of you will know that within 2 weeks of Occupy Wall Street, after the mass media tried to ignore it for the first week, then the set to on the Brooklyn Bridge kind of threw it massively into the media and into public awareness. And all of a sudden we had those amazing public opinion polls telling us after just over 2 weeks that Occupy Wall Street was twice as popular as the Tea Party in the United States. Now come on folks, the Tea Party has a lot of deep pockets. They got a lot of people with a lot of connections and a lot of millions of dollars, okay? And for a little ragtag youth movement to go into Zuccotti Park, have a confrontation with the police on Brooklyn Bridge, and somehow be twice as popular, tells us really, I think, a lot about both the enormous creativity of the movement, but also the possibilities that lie ahead. I don't, when I say that, want to suggest that there are not a lot of very difficult moments. I mean, you're facing one of the most brutal, vicious lockouts in this city that we've seen in a very long time. And as I was saying to some of tonight's organizers earlier, it looks very probable that we will be facing a lockout of thousands of city workers in Toronto in the next few weeks. I mean, the other side remains absolutely unrelenting in their commitment to driving this austerity agenda through. But having said that, it's clear that resistance makes a difference. Occupy has shown that, but also in Toronto, I'm part of a network called Stop the Cuts. And for about a year, Stop the Cuts has been building neighborhood-based committees in communities across the city, about 12 different communities. All kinds of different protests. Sometimes our meetings are 40 or 50 people, and occasionally we get, you know, larger crowds to do a picket outside a library, say we refuse to have our library closed, and that sort of thing. But it made sufficient difference that last Tuesday, $19 million worth of social services were restored. We're going to be cut. We're still losing things, so don't misunderstand me. We're still losing some things. But significant cuts to public transit were reversed. 3 homeless shelters that were meant to be closed will stay open. These are not insignificant kinds of accomplishments, and there are many other kinds of programs. It's a reminder that we're in this moment where the kind of mobilizing that we're doing, learning from these new protest movements, from Egypt to the Indignants in Spain to Occupy Wall Street, that this is also a moment where a genuinely mass new left could emerge over a period of time. But we have to be thinking, I think, also in the sort of scale that our rulers are. Our rulers say decade of austerity, age of austerity. I think we need to be thinking decade of resistance and mobilizing, age of resistance and mobilizing. In other words, we're not going to win everything next week or even in 2012. But if we're thinking in terms of the fact that this is the new terrain for us for the next 10 or 20 years, and we're thinking of building a mass new left inspired by the kinds of struggles that I've been talking about, then I think that kind of movement building perspective has a lot to offer for us, where we can, but recognize at the same time that you can win significant victories along the way. The 19 million in cuts that we released earlier this week is a very significant victory for an awful lot of people, and we're going to be moving next onto fronts like social housing, because just in this part of Toronto where I live, they're talking about selling off 200 to 300 units of social housing. So we're going to be mobilizing against those kinds of sell-offs and so on. Every little victory we win both makes some people's lives a little bit better, and it contributes to the idea that building a movement to change the world isn't just about having a vision of a new society, which I think we need, a society of solidarity and cooperation, not competition and profit, but also that the movement building is as meaningful in the here and now for what it wins as it is for the future that we might create. And so it's with that that I'll say, okay, to Mervyn King. We might have expected more anger, but there is something moving, and we need to be a part of it. I'm really looking forward to being part of what you folks will be building here tomorrow with the demonstration that's happening. But I think, as I say, we also need to be talking and strategizing together about how we're building over the years ahead. So thanks very much, and once again, thanks to Occupy London.
Just a couple quick announcements, and then open up the floor for some discussion, which is just the beginning. But as everybody probably already knows, there is a massive rally tomorrow at 11 o'clock at Victoria Park. And bring lots of signs, pots and pans. We're not too sure what the parade route is going to be necessarily, or how long it's going to be, so there's a lot of speculation. But 11 a.m. and it should be huge. So if you have any questions, raise your hand. We could probably do this as an open discussion. We probably don't need too much facilitation. Anybody, any questions?
I guess the reason why I don't have a real pending question is because you explain things very concisely. So I'm glad I'm here for that. I'm glad I came. This is really important for all of us to learn. And I think I'm really hoping that more people can start learning this too. Which leads me to the question: is how do we try to encourage more people to listen to this type of stuff and get this kind of discourse into broader spheres?
Do you see, you see dominant power as basically exercising basically elite interests right now, and you see the Tea Party as a sponsor, or an organization sponsored by that dominant power. Do you see that the similarities of anger that is expressed by Tea Party members and Occupy members, or is that more like a fabrication or something that's more implanted in that sense? And then the second part of that question is effectively, if indeed they are two separate entities, because from my perspective, I do see a reactionary sentiment amongst conservative people regarding directions of the economy, which only exacerbate problems as far as I see. So I'm wondering whether or not you would agree that it would be two fronts that we more or less have to strategize resistance for.
You mentioned that there was a significant assistance on behalf of the government for Canadian banks. Did the Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation have nothing to do with that?
I remember last year watching a lot of the stuff in Europe, starting to fold in a little earlier than that, and it just struck a lot of us really odd that there wasn't any of that in the Western press, and we all thought it was more or less a deliberate attempt to hide the upcoming, austerity wave, so to speak. What's your opinion on that?
When politicians talk about reducing the deficit, they're only talking about reducing the annual deficit, how much we go under every year in the budget. But there's this accumulated deficit that nobody ever talks about, that's billions and billions. What do you think should be done about that?
I'd like to talk about that new phase that we're developing into that you were mentioning, and how London's one of the places sort of taking the lead.
Shall I start with those?
Sure.
You guys kind of pose really good, strong, big ones. Okay, let's see if there's an order here. Yeah, okay. I'll start actually with the second last one, the debt and deficit business, because one of the things that I think we do need to make clear is that government debt and deficits are in and of themselves not a big deal, in and of themselves. I mean, somebody, for instance, who's gainfully employed and takes out a mortgage on a house and plans to pay for it over 20 or 25 years. There's nothing kind of disastrous about that. It's simply saying that you're pledging some of your future income to pay back a loan you're taking out today. The key, of course, is the gainfully employed part. That's really the key, that you've got to have that income coming in regularly. For governments, debt is, at one level, is super easy because, after all, they have a monopoly on the power to tax the population. And so I would say the same thing. There's no particular reason to get worried about government debt and deficits in general. The tricky part comes when governments build up debts and deficits very, very rapidly at a moment when financiers out there, hedge funds and so on, begin to become doubtful about their capacity to pay back. This is what's happened to Greece. They're now, in fact, they've just about finished negotiating the terms of it, but for the last year and a half, they've been betting on the probability of a Greek default on its debts. But it's really, really important to remember something that relates exactly to the question of what the media does and doesn't tell us. When they say to us, there is a Greek bailout, okay, we need to actually be able to say, stop. There is no such thing as a Greek bailout. The country called Greece isn't being bailed out, and the people of Greece aren't being bailed out. What happens in a so-called bailout is that the money is given to the government, who immediately hands it over to the banks that own the country's debt. The government is a temporary conduit. It's like a relay station, because all they're doing with those trillions that they get is paying off their creditors. Okay? So the reason that they've been so worried about the Greek debt, you think about it, well, Greece is a pretty small country in a very large Eurozone. Its economy is less than 3% of the total European economy. Why the fixation on Greece? And the answer is really elementary. Enough European banks bought Greek debt to the point where if Greece were to default, you'd have a new wave of bank crises across Europe. And so what we're really just seeing is, they give Greece 60 billion. That 60 billion, like I say, spends a few minutes in the treasury, and then it's just dispersed to the banks that they're paying back. So that's the second side. I think one of the really important things is that they avoided talking about what was going on in Greece and other parts of Europe for quite a while because probed too closely, you start to figure out the mechanics of what's happening. But this is just a giant bailout for the banks again. And that's really what we're seeing. And that takes me to the first point around education and popular education. I think on the radical left in Toronto, we made a mistake, which is that in 2008, we created something called the Popular Education Project. And we brought together a lot of different grassroots social movements and so on to talk about developing our analysis so that all the groups were capable of doing community workshops, meetings with unions and so on, doing popular education around the crisis. And then at a certain moment, so much was on our plates that we stopped doing that. And I think in retrospect it was a mistake because really what your question raises is how do we start to create those institutional spaces where a popular critical analysis is worked through in a way that people feel, yeah, I could now sit down with people at school, at work, in my community organization, and I could lay out an analysis for them so that we're spreading a critical understanding all the time. And I think that is one of the challenges of when I talk about this 10, 20 years. We've got to do that.
But I'm thinking too, you could think going beyond institutional spaces, like even thinking like culturally and
absolutely
streetscape. You play the game of advertisers.
Totally. I think if we've learned anything from the Occupy moment, it has to be the proliferation of creative tactics and forms of popular education. So as you say, street theater, use of community radio, workshops, imagine using street theater to actually occupy some public site for an hour and do skits and speeches and so on. So yes, I think you're absolutely right on that. And I do see that as a real sort of key component of what lies ahead for us. The question on the Tea Party and Occupy, what I would say is this. The Tea Party development represents a very strange convergence of elements of economic populism with pretty blatant elements of white racism, with really reactionary ideas about America, the free market, and patriotism, and the flag, and all of that. In other words, there is something in there that is a response to this particular economic moment. A lot of the Tea Partiers hate the bank bailouts, for instance. But often the terms of expressing that hatred for the bank bailouts are free market terms. They use economic liberal stuff about free markets rather than using an economic justice analysis about the millions of people who are losing their homes in the United States who never get bailed out, whereas Goldman Sachs does get bailed out, and so on. But I don't think there's any doubt that the Tea Party represents also, basic demographic terms, a constituency which is highly susceptible to a kind of white racist analysis. In particular, if you note what Newt Gingrich and others are doing right now in the US primaries for the Republicans, the way they have started to refer to Obama as the food stamp president. That's completely racially coded. By the way, going back to my point about food stamps earlier, the majority of people in the United States receiving food stamps are white. Okay? But there is a racist caricature that it's all black people who receive food stamps. And when Gingrich does that in a racist state like South Carolina, which still flies the Confederate flag, okay, he's deliberately messaging on racial theme. And I think it's really vital that Occupy and other movements be really important to challenge that. I don't doubt that there's some confused, poor people who've gotten pulled around the rope of the Tea Party because it represents protest and anger and so on. But I think that has to be taken on straight on. And what's interesting about it as well, the Tea Party, is that prior to Occupy, it was not the case that the Tea Party was holding the largest rallies in the United States. The largest rallies prior to Occupy were immigrant rights rallies happening in the United States against the Arizona legislation, the Florida legislation, the Texas legislation, and so on. These mobilizations were much, much bigger than the Tea Party, it's just they didn't have deep pockets, and so they weren't registered on the radar, at least not to the same degree. And the question of Occupy and what I said in terms of, I think, the importance of what Occupy London is doing, and I would, on the US scene, I would highlight both Occupy Oakland and the work that it has done with rank and file trade union activists. I spent about 8 or 9 days in the Bay Area in the spring, met with a lot of activists in Oakland and San Francisco, and so I wasn't surprised, because again, these are people who've been doing some, laying the basis for some of this work for a number of years. I would also say that some really interesting anti-foreclosure work has been done by parts of the Occupy movement as well in the last number of months. When I was in New York in December, some really good actions in Brooklyn, for instance, where you go and you occupy to prevent somebody being foreclosed on. And that's really interesting because it's using the new methods. It's also going back to a technique that was used brilliantly in the 1930s in places like Harlem, where you would mobilize hundreds and hundreds of people to stop the sheriff and the bailiff from evicting people. So I think those are elements of the kind of next agenda for Occupy. And clearly, I don't think there's any doubt that in the context of what's coming with austerity, you can imagine all kinds of ways of adapting and developing Occupy tactics. I mean, I was at a meeting on Sunday of what we call the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, and I threw out the idea that if the city workers get locked out, then our Stop the Cuts movement and the Workers' Assembly and Occupy, for instance, should have rolling occupations of city parks, because city parks are going to have scabs coming in to clean them. The rinks in city parks are going to have scabs coming in. By the way, they've had these companies lined up for a long time. So you go into your community park and you occupy and you say both, no service cuts, keep the scabs out. We insist on our right as a community to have control over what happens in our city parks and all that. So you can see all kinds of different configurations. We're not yet sure whether some library branches will close. Again, you can see, I mean, I remember doing street canvassing in the summer in Toronto, and one of the questions on our Stop the Cuts questionnaire for people, by the way, it was a really creative use of questionnaires because they're actually meant to engage people in conversations and so on. One of the questions on the questionnaire was, what kind of protest would you support? What kind of protest would you personally engage in? And I always found that when I got to the question, an occupation, everyone, oh no. So I cheated a little bit. It wasn't on the questionnaire, but I said, we were canvassing right in front of the public library. And I said, after that, I said, well, what if it was this library and they're going to close it? And the number of people who said, no, I would never do an occupation, who then said, oh, well, yeah, this library. Okay? Because all of a sudden it wasn't the abstraction. of an occupation, it's something very tangible and meaningful in the life of their community. Everybody knows who these library branches in inner city Toronto cater to, who their constituencies and clientele. So yeah, I think that what we're talking about is the next stage for Occupy is one in which a combination of tactics, which will include mass pickets of the kind that we've seen, for instance, in England, to close the docks. Occupations of parks, libraries. I can very readily imagine we might occupy social housing sites in Toronto that they want to privatize, for instance. And, you know, have that sense of it as a movement which is reaching out more and more into all kinds of communities and neighborhoods that haven't yet been part of Occupy. That's what these actions in places like Brooklyn around foreclosures are doing. But also bringing in whole new layers of people from trade unions, unorganized workers, and so on into it. So I think it's it's a daunting moment, but I think there's some really interesting possibilities. And so I've been really encouraged to see what Occupy London is doing, not only around the lockout, but particularly there also as an example.
You said you were at the...
Oh, hang on, and I forgot, I didn't come back on the question of the Canadian bank bailout, so I will come back to that later.
You said you were at the City Hall the other night when all that stuff went down. Could you give a brief description as to what you saw happen there? Yeah. And what came about afterwards because of it?
Yeah. Look, we have... I don't know if Toronto's unique in this way. I don't think it's entirely unique, but it may be more of an issue. We have been trying to deal for quite some time in the radical left in Toronto with sometimes pretty sharp divides between the younger, more community-based social movements and the more traditional labor movement. And and a lot of acrimony, a lot of mistrust. And nobody, as always in these situations, nobody's faultless. But on the other hand, we also have to get beyond it. We have to figure out how to get beyond it. And sometimes, in my view, the labor movement is very stuck in certain tactics from the past. And in the lead up to the action that we had outside our City Hall on Tuesday. And the reason, by the way, is that the City Council was going to vote on the Mayor's proposed cutbacks budget. Okay, so that was on the table Tuesday night at City Council. And Stop the Cuts, this grassroots organization, had been working for about a year around it, had held a wonderful mass assembly in a park in September of about 600 people from different communities. 4 or 5 hour session where people from communities came together